Let's finish up the chapter on politics. Section 5, Postmodernism. The old saying, everybody talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it, is perhaps an appropriate aphorism for postmodern politics. Remember from our postmodernism chapter, postmodernists believe reality is not directly accessible to us. We operate based on our interpretations of reality, which are in turn based on our cultural and personal situations. In the end, though, we must all be governed. Unfortunately, postmodernism is primarily a critical theory that presumably points out problems, but avoids proposing concrete solutions because, for postmodernists, politics is only and always a tool of oppression. Critiquing the abuse is the solution. There's nothing more to be done. This view of politics sounds like anarchism, and in a way, it is advocating anarchy. Jean-Francois Lyotard explained, with the destruction of the grand narratives, there is no longer any unifying identity for the subject or society. Instead, individuals are the sites where ranges of conflicting moral and political codes intersect, and the social bond is fragmented. If that sounds bad, it's because fragmented is bad. You're all by yourself, all alone. Although then that means that you get to make whatever rules you want. So let's go on. Barbara Epstein observes, one reason that postmodernism has taken hold so widely is that it is much easier to be critical than to present a positive vision. In some ways, then, postmodernism has become a form of carrying on about the problems rather than proposing workable solutions. Some people might call this whining, but postmodernism is resolute. If modern narratives fail to account for reality, political visions will only make things worse. We can't solve problems. We can only manage them. We call this view political pessimism to draw attention to the gloominess postmodernists feel about the whole realm of politics. Postmodernists suffer from what French cultural theorist Jean Baudrillard called a cynical, despairing rejection of belief. Why the despair? Anthony Thompson says it is fueled by the failure of Marxian-inspired state socialism. Apparently, postmodernists had a crush on Marxism. When it broke their hearts, they despaired of ever falling in love again. Michael Foucault exemplified political pessimism. He believed there was no ultimate purpose, or telos, to life, no deep teleology of a primeval destination. Foucault contented himself with developing what he called a genealogy of morals, a means of exploring how people deviously secure their influence. People in power develop systems of marking, classifying, record-keeping, and evaluating to make their despotism seem matter-of-fact. Once in power, politicians don't violently dismember their opponents, they suck their blood through bureaucracy. All governments do this, whether democracies or dictatorships, according to Foucault. Do you imagine the mechanisms of power that operate between technicians, foremen, and workers are that much different here and in the Soviet Union? Not all postmodernists are pessimistic about politics. The writings of Jean-Francois Lyotard, Richard Rorty, and to some extent Foucault hinted at a politics that can be used at the local level to enhance individual freedom and bring about progressive change. The solutions are almost always liberal, though. Stephen R.C. Hicks agrees, writing, of the major names in the postmodernist movement, there is not a single figure who is not left-wing in a serious way. Rorty, for example, embraced a straight-line progressivism with an anti-Christian bias. I see the orthodox, and that means the people who think that hounding gays out of the military promotes traditional family values. I see the orthodox as the same honest, decent, blinkered, disastrous people who voted for Hitler in 1933. I see the progressives as defining the only America I care about. Though Foucault often just played with words and ideas as if they were a game, the political positions he did stake out were radical. When asked about Marxist revolution, for example, he said, "When the proletariat takes power, it may be quite possible that the proletariat will exert toward the classes over which it has triumphed a violent, dictatorial, and even bloody power. I can't see what objection could possibly be made to this." When a group of people gains power and immediately turns toward exacting vengeance against its enemies rather than implementing a positive agenda, it tells you everything you need to know about what that group truly values. Foucault's nonchalant response to Marxist off with their heads mentality challenges everything he taught about justice and oppression. Postmodernists, while typically content to point fingers, have among them those who have observed political oppression and decided to act. Out of this impulse to fix things has emerged something called identity politics. Identity politics refers to the way certain groups of people are oppressed because of who they are, women, minorities, and homosexuals, for example. The goal of identity politics is not truth, though, but revolt against oppressive structures. Alan Sokal quotes feminist Kelly Oliver. In order to be revolutionary, feminist theories should be political tools, strategies for overcoming oppression in specific concrete situations. The goal, then, of feminist theory should be to develop strategic theories, not true theories, not false theories, but strategic theories. Whether it truly represents reality is not as important as whether it works. Today, universities are the battleground for intense conflict between people demanding power. What some call political correctness includes speech codes and sensitivity training for people considered to be unenlightened. For example, a woman who opposes abortion is cast as one trying to strip other women of power and dignity and masking her power grab in the language of protecting babies. To the forces of political correctness, this person needs to undergo re-education to adjust her antiquated views. Similarly, people who think homosexual practice is wrong are said to be using the language of morality to strip homosexuals of their humanity, and this must be corrected at the earliest age before bigotry takes hold. Postmodernism often originates in despair over what postmodernists see as a failure of political leadership. But instead of lifting people to hope for and work for a genuinely good political force capable of ruling well on behalf of its citizens, it tends toward destruction. If politics is about power, and power is about oppression, people who possess power must be assumed to be guilty and stripped of their influence. Of course, with no standard by which guilt or innocence can be measured, we have nothing to trust but the word of postmodern critics. This is the postmodernist path to power. Deplore it and then seize it. Will postmodernists be able to use this power to seek true justice, or will they use their influence to turn the tables and claw out the eyes of those they believe have blinded them? New Spirituality. Section 6. New Spirituality, remember, is a Western version of Eastern religions, a New Age philosophy, religion, and lifestyle. New Spiritualists are concerned about the failure of political institutions, not just because they despise quarreling and corruption, but because their growth has taken over the personal responsibility individuals used to take. Marilyn Ferguson said, "The failure of other social institutions has caused us to heap even more responsibility on government, the most unwieldy institution of all. We have relinquished more and more autonomy to the state, forcing government to assume functions once performed by communities, families, churches, people. Many social tasks have reverted to government by default, and the end result has been creeping paralysis, unreality. The political system needs to be transformed, not reformed," said Ferguson. "This won't happen unless individual people get their acts together. Social transformation follows a chain reaction of personal change. If we want good government, we must first of all govern ourselves." Ferguson called this approach to governance autarky, which means the governing self. Though personal transformation is important to other worldviews, such as Christianity, no other worldview, not even Christianity, puts as much emphasis as New Spirituality on personal transformation as the key to political transformation. New Spiritualists talk about increasing people's personal power, not to foment revolution, but to clear away life's debris. The stream of consciousness, then, may flow pure and clean. This, to Ferguson, was power used not as a battering ram or to glorify the ego, but in service to life, appropriate power. To New Spiritualists, personal power could lead to transformation on a global scale, transcending all material and individual boundaries, including national and political ones. According to Donald Hughes, humanity is on the verge of something entirely new, a further evolutionary step unlike any other, the emergence of the first global civilization. How exactly does personal transformation lead to political transformation? New Spiritualists believe collective consciousness is perfection. If we change to align ourselves with it, the world changes too. Ferguson explained, the new collective is the new politics. As soon as we begin to work for a different kind of a world, the world changes for us. Ferguson was a clear and compelling writer whose infectious vision for the future made her a trusted sage to several liberal leaders, including Al Gore and Dennis Kucinich. But it was a quantum physicist named John Hagelin who really laid New Spirituality's political cards on the table by forming a political philosophy and even a political party. The story of how this happened is fascinating. In the 1960s, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi invented Transcendental Meditation, or TM, and gained fame as the guru to the Beatles, the music group. His 40,000 trained teachers spread the word, building training centers and even a college, the Maharishi University of Management in tiny Fairfield, Iowa. Approximately 1,000 students attend the university, learning how to use transcendental meditation to study more effectively and advance their careers. Hagelin, a professor at the university, articulated the Maharishi's political ideas in Manual for a Perfect Government, subtitled How to Harness the Laws of Nature to Bring Maximum Success to Governmental Administration. In the early 1990s, Hagelin formed a new political party, the Natural Law Party, NLP, which included a military policy calling for a coherence creating group of 5,000 to 10,000 troops to rush into trouble spots to meditate. This prevention wing, Hagelin claimed, is fully capable of preventing the outbreak of war. While probably not all New Spiritualists agree with the principles of the Natural Law Party, all do seem to agree that personal transformation will bring about political transformation, which results in less crime, better treatment of workers, greater health, and increasing prosperity. Advocates think these results may even bring the various political parties together, since all of their concerns will be addressed. People will be better taken care of, taxes will go down, the environment will be cleaner, and government will shrink. In the end, believes Mark Satin, these changes will spread around the entire globe, leading to much more planetary cooperation. New Spiritualists are careful to maintain that their idea of planetary cooperation is different from a politically oriented world government, as in secularism, Marxism, and Islam. David Spangler explains, unlike many historical expressions of the one world idea, which focus in particular upon the establishment of a world government, the vision of the New Age qua-planetary civilization arises less out of politics than out of what is called the holistic vision. So to New Spiritualists, change starts with the person. Power to the people, said Marilyn Ferguson, one by one by one. Satin says, in New Age society, we would learn to make our own decisions and not to hang on others, but that wouldn't isolate us from others. It would make us more attractive to others and more confident about being in community with them. The idea of autarky, or self-government, assumes a lot of the planet's 7 billion inhabitants who may not want to go along with the program or who may be suspicious of it. Never fear, says Satin, if enough people get on board, humanity's evolution toward a new world order can be speeded up. This approach is not without its problems. The move toward a planetary order will require people to release strong convictions. Former United Nations Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller said, "Religions must actively cooperate to bring to unprecedented heights a better understanding of the mysteries of life and of our place in the universe. My religion, right or wrong, must be abandoned forever in the planetary age." Of course, new spiritualists argue that what they're doing is not religious but scientific. Consciousness is what it is. Aligning with it is really the only long-term option. It's physics, not religion, they say. The new spiritualist worldview of politics is a strange brew made by mixing together God is energy, not a person, with people are basically good and perfectible, while adding a touch of godlikeness and sifting out our sin nature. It's a utopian plan, but the true definition of the word utopia means no place, and that's exactly where its critics are afraid it will lead. Islam, Section 7. While there are obviously some exceptions, such as the nation of Turkey, which at this writing is a secular state with a predominant Muslim population, the overarching goal of Islamic politics seems to be the establishment of a global Islamic state ruled by religious leaders, or Islamic theocracy, according to the principles of Sharia law. The mechanism is, according to prominent Muslim authors, jihad, though their use of the term does not always entail terrorizing unbelievers. Rather, jihad calls for warfare against anything hindering the advance of Islam, whether the temptations of the flesh or the reticence of non-believers. I read that slow on purpose. All Muslims must participate, Khurshid Ahmad says. Jihad has been made obligatory, which means that the individual should, when the occasion arises, offer even his life for the defense and protection of Islam and the Islamic State. Remember from our chapter on Islam that a Muslim is one who performs the 5 pillars of Islam and believes the Quran to be the complete and final revelation of God. Commitment to God involves sacrifice of one's time, energy, and wealth to promote the cause. Jihad implies a readiness to give whatever one has, including his or her life, for the sake of Allah. Jesus taught his disciples not to take up arms against his detractors, but Muhammad taught his disciples to conquer anyone who opposed them or who refused to become Muslims. Afif-e-Tabara recounts an example of Muhammad's teachings in action. Muhammad sent his delegates to 8 neighboring rulers with messages calling them to embrace Islam. The appeal was rejected. Some of them even killed the Prophet's delegates, and some tore the message and threatened the delegates who had brought it. In that case, Muslims found no other alternative but fighting, after being certain that those rulers had slain the Prophet's delegates, misled their people, and ruled them in oppression and tyranny. The message these delegates carried was essentially, you see our power and what happens to those who resist? Convert to Islam now and secure peace for yourselves. In Islam, peace means the state of submission experienced after everyone either adopts Islam or submits to its rule. Contemporary Muslim apologists attempt to soften the concept of jihad, emphasizing its call to self-discipline or arguing that the early conquests of Muhammad and his companions were purely defensive. It makes sense, in our age of tension between Muslims and non-Muslims, that Muslims would emphasize jihad as the internal spiritual struggle of Muslims. Downplaying the role of jihadi aggression helps alleviate their neighbors' and friends' fears, but what is often not said, publicly at least, is that many jihadis see the personal discipline aspect of jihad as a Muslim's war against his own flesh, so that he may be disciplined in the fight against non-Muslim forces. It is inaccurate and misleading to say that jihad has nothing to do with the war for Islamic supremacy. The assertion that Muslims see jihad as purely defensive simply does not fit the historical facts. Fazlur Rahman writes, "The most unacceptable explanation on historical grounds, however, is the stand of those modern Muslim apologists who have tried to explain the jihad of the early community in purely defensive terms. Early jihad, and jihad ever since, has never been purely defensive, but rather characteristically offensive, as the history of Islam clearly reveals. Indeed, the only way that one can understand the Crusades, with their many excesses, is to realize that they were a response to 2 centuries of aggression, when Islamic armies poured across North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and today's Middle East." What consequences would follow successful jihad? Primarily, we would expect that Muslims would insist on developing a separate form of law by which they would be governed. As we saw in the law chapter, this is called Sharia. Components of Sharia are increasingly being implemented in Europe and even in the United States. The late Kirsten Heissig, a German judge, said, "The law is slipping out of our hands. It's moving to the streets or into a parallel system where an imam or another representative of the Quran determines what must be done." Muslims are allowed to practice Sharia in limited circumstances in countries like Canada, Australia, and Great Britain, but it is coming to America as well. Ali Khan, a Muslim man who serves as a professor of law at Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas, has defended even some of the most radical provisions of Sharia, including the practice of killing Muslims who leave the faith. Harvard's Muslim chaplain, Taha Abdul Basar, has proclaimed that such killing may make people uncomfortable, but there is a great wisdom in it, and it should not be dismissed out of hand. In Crescent Moon Rising, Paul Williams documents the growth of radical Islam in America, including a growing number of wife-beating and honor-killing cases. As Muslims take the first place in a given society, they become the leaders, and non-believers are made to submit. In Muslim-dominated countries, Christians and Jews, or people of the book, are called dhimmis, and are expected to express submission to their Muslim rulers by paying a tax called jizya. The Quran says, "Fight those who believe not in God, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by God and his apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." Paying the tax is a tribute to Muslim authority and a tacit agreement that their personal views, what Abdullah Yusuf Ali called their personal liberty of conscience, are to be kept to themselves. A few Muslim leaders, very few, publicly criticize this program of takeover. An Indian Muslim leader, Akbar Ladak, revealed the true aims of the Islamists bent on takeover and called on his Muslim brothers and sisters to resist them. He said, "Today, our relatively free, increasingly multicultural societies are under threat, first and foremost by Muslim extremists who have declared their intent to bring about a global caliphate. Theirs is a hateful and misogynist philosophy, financed by oil-rich dictators. That it twists my beloved faith to justify a simplistic ideology gives it a powerful allure for Muslims who haven't had the exposure to varied ideas and strains within Islam. We, Muslims living in free societies, need to be in the forefront of this fight. We fight not only for the security and integrity of the societies we live in, but also for the soul of our faith. Only we can present an alternative interpretation of Islam which promotes the vision of peace, progress, and equality." Reading between the lines of Ladak's statement, one can see the true agenda and immense power of the Islamist leaders as they move forcefully toward a global Islamic state. If Ladak is worried, maybe we should be worried too. But there is hope. Perhaps it is possible to form a coalition of reform-minded Muslims and non-Muslims to halt the abuses of radical Islamists. Section 8, Christianity. The essential Christian political worldview is this: citizens of the kingdom of heaven should be the best citizens in the kingdom of the world because their allegiance is to something higher than the state. God insists his people do justice, love mercy, and walk in humility with him. That's in Micah. If they do, it is a hopeful antidote to the hopelessness of legal positivism, the idea that the law is what those in authority have agreed to do, with no particular tie to morality. If there is nothing higher than the state, then the state is God and right in all it does. Hitler's perverse medical experiments performed on children without anesthesia, leading to their deaths, were legal because Hitler was the law. Indeed, opposing those acts was, by the reasoning of legal positives, illegal because the state is supreme and whoever controls it is right. In a fallen world, government's primary mission is to preserve justice and punish evil so that humans may flourish. This sometimes calls for the protection of human life by the taking of human life, as in capital punishment and just war. In Genesis 9:6, we see the development of civil government when cities were formed around the principle of preventing human bloodshed. But would government have been necessary if humans were not fallen? Not for punishing evil, of course, but punishing evil is not all that governments do. Governments establish order, set up structures to deliver goods and services such as roads and utilities, keep records, ensure a smooth flow of traffic, and so forth. Interestingly, government seems to be part of God's perfect plan of redemption. Among the names given Jesus Christ throughout the Bible is a political title, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The Christian worldview sees government as an institution God established to promote security and justice, or order, protect the innocent, and secure the rights God has granted so people can flourish. This is a position articulated at length by St. Augustine and later affirmed by many Christian thinkers, including John Calvin and Martin Luther. It is a position rooted in Scripture because God ordained government. It is a sacred institution whose rulers are ministers of God for good. The Apostle Peter instructed Christians to submit for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Through time, at least half a dozen views of politics have emerged in the church. We will first take a look at 5 of these that have philosophical problems, and then consider an orthodox Christian view. It is critical that you answer this question yourself. Would Jesus even want his followers to be involved in politics? Section 9. The 5 Christian positions on political involvement. The first one is that Christians shouldn't be involved. In response to intellectual attacks on Christianity in the 1800s, some Christian leaders tried to make peace by insisting that religion and the intellect occupy different domains, answer different questions, and therefore pose no threat to one another. Henry Ward Beecher, the famous 19th century preacher and brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, said, "While we are taught by the scientists in truths that belong to the sensual nature, while we are taught by the economists of things that belong to the social nature, we need the Christian ministry to teach us those things which are invisible." Though we respect Beecher's work as an abolitionist, we think his compromise gives away too much. Saying that Christianity deals only with the invisible is to create a secular, sacred divide in which we are not permitted to bring biblically informed solutions to bear on our nation's problems. 2. Society isn't worth redeeming. Joel Carpenter summarizes a common view among Christian leaders in the late 1800s and through the 1900s about societal change. He said, "What were the prospects for the true church then, in these times of decline and apostasy? Fundamentalists believed that God would continue to use his faithful remnant to witness to the truth and gather out of the world a people for his name. Until Jesus came for them at the rapture, Bible-believing Christians were to win the lost, heed the signs of the times, keep themselves pure from error, and expose and condemn false religion." For example, 19th century evangelist Dwight L. Moody said, "I look upon this world as a wrecked vessel. God has given me a lifeboat and said to me, 'Moody, save all you can.'" While this is well-intentioned, Moody's statement pulled Christians' attention away from making society better, and many churches prided themselves on this anti-cultural perspective. Life was hard, and the church was a place to go to find temporary relief by reminding oneself of the heavenly delights that awaited the faithful. But this perspective assumes that what happens on this earth is ultimately unimportant to God, a theology that cannot be sustained scripturally. The third view, political structures can't change the human heart. When Shane Claiborne walks on stage, what the audience sees is a skinny white guy with dreadlocks. What they hear, though, is a hard-hitting social justice message delivered with winsomeness and humor. Part of Claiborne's message is to encourage Christians to stay out of politics. Jesus taught that his followers should not attempt to run the world, he says. For Claiborne, Christians are citizens of heaven only. We should have no allegiance to an earthly kingdom. The best we can do is form an alternate community so attractive to people in the world that they want to join it. Without a doubt, politics can become an idol, and we must resist any program encouraging people to turn to politics rather than to Christ for salvation. But just because something doesn't change hearts does not mean it is unimportant. Police don't change the human heart, but we still think law enforcement has value. Food doesn't change our spiritual condition, but we still eat. Politics can't bring heaven to earth, but it can bring heavenly values to bear on earthly problems. As Thomas Aquinas put it, grace does not destroy nature, but completes it. 4. Christianity is only about the institution of the church and is not relevant to civil government. Two Kingdoms theology hails from a small group of Reformed theologians who teach that Martin Luther's distinction between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of man actually represents the kingdom of the church and the kingdom of the world. The Bible, they say, is only relevant to the life of the church, not to civil government. One advocate of the Two Kingdoms theology, Michael Horton, phrases it straightforwardly. The central message of Christianity is not a worldview, a way of life, or a program for personal and societal change. It is a gospel. Of course, it's debatable whether these theologians have properly interpreted Luther and whether it's a good idea even if they have. The fact is, people always make decisions based on some system of ethics. If this system isn't biblically informed, it will be informed by something else. 5. Christians should be involved, and they should try to take over. Some Christians don't run away from politics, they run toward it. Their enthusiasm is admirable, but it is all too easy to just become appendages of one of the political parties, serving its interests instead of God's. Christians on both the right and the left can suffer from the political illusion. Some believe that liberals of ill intent have hijacked America, and they think their job is to reclaim America for Christ, whatever the cost. Others see a spiritual dimension in government itself and are not above shaming conservatives as unspiritual, even mean-spirited and unchristian. The French thinker Jacques Ellul warned of what he called the political illusion, which assumes that all problems are, at root, political. Consequently, it is also assumed that all solutions are political. Is there a common ground between these various factions? Probably not. People hold their views for very deep reasons. Their upbringing, their sense of moral rightness, the people who have influenced their lives, or the applause of those whose admiration they crave. Instead of looking for a middle ground, let's see if we can find something of an original position in the Bible about the structures of society and the gospel's influence therein. At the very least, such a study will help us live with greater integrity in grappling with the difficult political issues of our day. Section 10, Jesus and Politics. Jesus didn't talk politics, some Christians claim. usually because they dislike the brand of involvement churchgoers are choosing. Even if it were the case that Jesus didn't talk politics, this approach is difficult to sustain biblically. Jesus did not work for a corporation, go to war, get married, or have children. What did Jesus do is inadequate for discerning how Christ's teachings should be applied to today's problems. Jesus lived consistently with a biblical understanding of how human beings are designed to bear God's image. The whole counsel of the Bible shows us how we might do the same. But to the particular question of whether Jesus was involved in politics during his ministry, we have several pieces of evidence that he was. First, the Gospels mention Jesus' frequent presence in the synagogue. In those days, according to Jewish scholar Lee I. Levine, the synagogue was not only a place of worship, but also a courtroom, school, hostel, a place for political meetings and social gatherings, and a center for community functions. Levine says the synagogue served the same purposes in the time of Jesus as the city gates served in Old Testament times, a gathering place for civic discourse or conversation, and at times adjudication of rival legal claims, a courtroom. It is difficult to imagine Jesus, as presented in the Gospels, being on the fringes of, rather than involved in community affairs. Second, in Jesus' time, politics and religion were tightly intertwined. Jesus interacted with many different groups, all of which had distinct religious and political views. Throughout Jesus' ministry, people from various sects tried to humiliate him. It backfired every time. On one occasion, some of the leaders tried to get Jesus to side either with the pro-Roman or anti-Roman forces by asking whether it was right to pay taxes to Caesar. Jesus replied, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." Matthew 22. This statement carries both political and religious significance. Third, Jesus himself never spoke explicitly against government. He never told his followers to eschew society and hide in the desert, like the Essenes, tear down government, like the revolutionary zealots, or join those in power, like the Herodians. He did not tell the centurion or any official of influence to quit his position, and he commonly used leaders of various sorts in his parables. Indeed, no New Testament writer told law enforcement, military, or government officials to quit their jobs if they came to Christ. In contrast, they were told to act honestly and justly in their respective vocations. You can look up Luke 3 and Acts 10. Even if Jesus' words and actions do not form an ideology of politics, they clearly do form a theology of engagement. God has something to say to a lost and dying world, and he has chosen us to be the mouthpieces. In Matthew 28, Jesus told the disciples to go out and make more disciples by teaching everyone everywhere to obey God in every area in which Jesus Christ has authority, which is all areas. It isn't just how to get to heaven, but how to obey God in all you do. Based on these considerations, here are some answers to common questions Christians ask about politics. Question 1. Why is political involvement necessary? James Madison said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But we are not angels, and government is necessary. Our evil inclinations must be kept in check by laws and a government capable of enforcing them. In America, the Founding Fathers grappled with the problem of protecting ordinary citizens from the sin natures of those in authority. They devised a system of checks and balances among the branches of government to prevent power from collecting in the hands of a few. By broadly distributing power and responsibility, the American system of government minimizes the abuse of power." Question 2. What is the purpose of government? According to the Christian worldview, God instituted human government to protect the rights he gave us. This protection or security, both from overt violence and more generally in structuring communities, is called political order. Human nature is capable of both vice and virtue. Protecting the human rights of life, liberty, property, work, rest, worship, and a free press from those who would diminish them means promoting order and justice. E. Calvin Beisner says justice and truth are interrelated, for justice is the practice of truth in human relationships. He concludes justice is rendering to each his due according to a right standard. The right standard is God's moral order, which is based on the very character of God. This standard insists that the innocent citizens of society be protected from those intent on marring God's image by depriving people of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. Third question, what is the government's responsibility? In the sociology chapter, we talked about two principles that apply in politics as well. The first was sphere sovereignty, Abraham Kuyper's idea that there are three primary spheres in society: government, church, and family. Each sphere or institution must be balanced with the others. The second principle was subsidiarity, which is the principle of mobilized communities of people seeking solutions at the level closest to the problem. Government's purpose is to secure justice and freedom. It possesses the power of prosecution and coercion to punish people for not doing what is right and to require of them the necessary support for securing justice and freedom. The church's purpose is to manifest God's love and grace on earth. Its powers are persuasion and compassion, getting people to see their need for God and tangibly helping lift them out of dire circumstances, restoring them to their image-bearing capacity. The family's purpose is to manifest God's community and creativity, including procreativity. It has the powers of procreation and community, influencing the world by raising children who will make a positive contribution to society. Given the delegated powers of government, it is unreasonable to ask government to exercise true compassion. It can only coerce or force people to help one another according to its own definition of help and prosecute them if they fail to do so. A government that attempts to regulate procreation, community, persuasion, and compassion inevitably smothers and oppresses its citizens. History tells us that government services and controls come at a high price, diminishing other institutions and establishing a base of power from which government grows in its forcefulness. Fourth question, what happens when government oversteps its bounds? Today, many political leaders do not understand their place in God's universe, and so they attempt to usurp God's sovereignty, which covers everyone and everything, everywhere, for all time. Psalm 103. Government can never take the place of the church. Charles Colson, a high-level political official who served a prison sentence for abuse of power and ultimately came to faith in Christ, gave a four-sided warning. Excise belief in God, and you are left with only two principles, the individual and the state. In this situation, however, there is no mediating structure to generate moral values and therefore no counterbalance to the inevitable ambitions of the state. William Penn concluded, if we are not governed by God, then we will be ruled by tyrants. Sadly, thousands of years of human experience prove this, and through time, the coercive activity of government has become even more brutal. Fifth question, doesn't Christian involvement lead to theocracy? The term theocracy means rule by religious leaders. As outlined in this chapter, we think Christian involvement is one of the few things that save a nation from theocracy. Islam assumes its leaders should be given greater power in order to create the perfect society. Secularism's belief that humans are perfectible, and Marxism's some are more equal than others view, share the same assumption. Christians, on the other hand, who believe in God's ultimate authority and a biblical view of human nature, are suspicious of claims about society's perfectibility. They distrust leaders who demand more power than is absolutely necessary to secure justice and freedom. Christianity is not utopian. Christians do not believe the state is the means to salvation. Chuck Colson wrote, while Christian teaching emphasizes that each person has worth and responsibility before God, Utopianism argues that salvation can only be achieved collectively. The Christian worldview is based on transcendent law applied impartially to all. It prizes accountability above efficiency and human flourishing above the accumulation of power. Question 6. Is there ever a time when Christians should disobey the government? The Christian view of politics begins with the sovereignty of God, not the sovereignty of the state. The Bible clearly tells Christians to respect, obey, and participate in governance because the state exists to do God's will. If the state structures itself in a way that denies justice or freedom rather than securing it, it must be opposed. Christians must be willing to say to governing authorities, as Peter did and the apostles said, we must obey God rather than men. We should be respectful but firm, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were when facing Nebuchadnezzar's demand for worship. In Daniel 3, it says, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Francis Schaeffer said the bottom line is that at a certain point, there is not only the right, but the duty to disobey the state. Resisting the laws of an unjust government is called civil disobedience. Our disobedience to the state may even result in imprisonment or death, but in such instances, it is for the sake of our conscience that we act in the hope that the consciences of our neighbors and leaders will be moved to restore justice. In a democratic form of government, citizens' duty to promote justice and freedom requires that they not blindly follow leaders who deny their responsibility to God. Rather, citizens hold them accountable by voting, persuading, petitioning, running for political office, or serving in non-elected positions where we may be able to influence those in power. The conclusion: God ordains governments to secure justice and freedom. When government authority rests within the bounds of this ordination, we submit willingly to the state's authority. When the state abuses its authority or claims to be sovereign over God, Christians must acknowledge God's transcendent law first. Contrary to people who say Christians are unpatriotic because they do not support the government in every instance, Christians should be able to say with a clear conscience that politics will be better when people always bring rightness to the government rather than assume the government is always right. Our ongoing struggle to create and maintain just government may or may not be effective. We must, however, remain obedient to God in all circumstances. As Chuck Colson said, Christians are to do their duty as best they can, but even when they feel that they are making no difference, that they are failing to bring Christian values to the public arena, success is not the criteria. Faithfulness is. A society with just laws and orderly governance is certainly a better place to live than a society without them. And if such a society has a reasonable means of ensuring the proper use of power to secure the good of the citizenry, it will be even better still. But how does this affect the way people make a living? How does it relate to how people provide goods and services to one another to secure a means of provision for their families? What role do law and politics play in these decisions? All of these questions revolve around the study of economics, and exploring how a Christian worldview answers them will be our goal in the next chapter. The end.